The laughter of the two officers echoed through the dark alley, their faces twisted with amusement as they yanked the final knot tight. The black man they had restrained against the pole remained still, his expression unreadable. To them, this was just another game, another night of flexing their power for fun. Jack Reynolds wiped a tear from his eye, still chuckling. "What's the matter, buddy? Thought you could just wander into our town without a warm welcome." Mike Sanders nudged his partner. "We should leave him like this for a while. See if he learns his lesson." They had done this before, harassing anyone who didn't belong. But what they didn't realize was that their victim wasn't just another passerby. He was their new police chief. And tomorrow morning, they would be walking into the biggest humiliation of their lives. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more shocking real-life justice stories. The ropes dug into David Carter's wrists as he remained tied against the cold metal pole, his breathing steady despite the humiliation he was enduring. Jack Reynolds and Mike Sanders stood in front of him, still grinning like schoolboys playing a cruel prank. To them, this was nothing more than a joke, a routine power trip they had pulled on countless men before him. The fact that their victim was black only made it more entertaining in their eyes. Jack folded his arms and smirked. "Ain't got much to say now, huh?" he taunted. Mike chuckled, nudging him. "Bet he won't be wandering through town at night anymore." They were so caught up in their amusement that neither of them noticed the way David was watching them, memorizing every detail, every word, every action. His silence wasn't fear. It was patience, because by morning these two would realize just how badly they had screwed up. David Carter had arrived in town earlier that day, hours before this incident, but not in uniform. He preferred to observe first, to understand the environment he was about to oversee. This small town, known for its deep-rooted prejudices, had struggled for years with corruption in its police force. It was exactly why he had been assigned as the new chief. But rather than making a grand entrance, David had chosen to walk the streets unannounced, blending in as just another citizen. He had hoped to find signs of change, signs that the town's officers were ready for real leadership. Instead, he had found Jack and Mike. Jack Reynolds had been with the department for over a decade, well known for his aggressive behavior toward minorities and his untouchable reputation. He believed in ruling through intimidation, not justice. His partner, Mike Sanders, was no better, always ready to follow Jack's lead, always eager to remind people who held the power in this town. Together, they had terrorized their community for years, hiding behind their badges, laughing in the face of accountability. Then there was Deputy Laura Matthews. Unlike her fellow officers, Laura had always believed in the badge for what it was meant to represent: justice, not control. But in a department run by men like Jack and Mike, her voice had been ignored. She had witnessed misconduct before, but challenging it would have meant putting a target on her back. And so, like many others, she had learned to keep her head down. But tonight would change everything. As David remained tied to the pole, headlights flashed down the alleyway. A familiar voice rang out, sharp, commanding. "What the hell is going on here?" Laura had arrived. She had been patrolling the area when she caught sight of the officers' vehicles parked suspiciously behind the bar. She had felt something was off. And now, as she stepped out of her cruiser and took in the scene, she knew she was right. Her breath caught when she saw the restrained man. He wasn't panicking, wasn't pleading. Instead, He looked at her with a knowing gaze, as if he was waiting for this very moment. Confused but alarmed, she turned back to Jack and Mike. "Are you out of your minds? Why is this man tied up?" Jack rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Relax, Matthews. We were just having a little fun. No harm done." David finally spoke, his voice smooth, deliberate. "No harm at all. In fact, this has been enlightening." Something about his tone sent a chill down Laura's spine. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Deputy Laura Matthews' heart pounded as she stepped closer, her flashlight illuminating the disturbing scene before her. The man's wrists were bound so tightly that the ropes had left deep marks on his skin. He stood restrained against the cold metal pole, yet his expression remained calm, too calm. Jack Reynolds and Mike Sanders, on the other hand, looked completely at ease, their smug grins making it clear they felt no remorse for what they had done. To them, this was just another night of flexing their authority, another cruel joke at someone else's expense. Laura's voice cut through the tension as she glared at them. "Untie him! Now!" Jack scoffed, rolling his eyes before shoving his hands into his pockets. "Relax, Matthews. It's just a joke," he muttered, nodding toward the restrained man. "Ain't that right, buddy? Just some good old small-town fun." Mike chuckled beside him. "You're acting like we did something serious. It's just a little lesson for an outsider. No harm done." David Carter, the man they had humiliated, finally moved. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. His voice was low and steady, completely devoid of fear. "Interesting sense of humor," he said, his piercing gaze locking onto Jack's. He didn't struggle, didn't raise his voice. He simply observed them, absorbing every detail, as if committing them to memory. Laura clenched her jaw. She had spent years watching these two abuse their authority, picking on those they believed couldn't fight back. But this was different. This wasn't just intimidation or harassment. They had physically restrained an innocent man, treating him like an object for their amusement. Something about the man's composure unsettled her, as if he wasn't just enduring their abuse. He was studying them. "Untie him," she ordered again, her tone sharper this time. Jack sighed dramatically before pulling out a knife and slicing through the ropes. The restraints fell to the ground, and David took his time stretching his fingers, rolling his shoulders, and rubbing the red marks on his wrists. His movements were controlled, almost calculated, as if he were shaking off more than just the pain. Laura took a step closer. "Do you need medical attention?" she asked, trying to read him. David gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. "I'll be just fine." Then, slowly, he turned toward Jack and Mike, his face unreadable. "This town sure has a unique way of welcoming newcomers." Jack smirked, patting Mike on the shoulder. "We make sure everyone knows their place." David exhaled slowly, finally breaking eye contact as he glanced at his watch. "Good to know." His words were measured, as if filing away this moment for later. With one last lingering glance, he turned on his heel and walked away, his steady footsteps echoing in the quiet alley. Laura watched him disappear into the night, an uneasy feeling settling deep in her stomach. There was something about him, something off. Most people who faced Jack and Mike's torment left angry or broken. This man left completely unfazed. Jack clapped his hands together, chuckling as he shook his head. "Man, you get worked up over nothing, Matthews." He shot Mike a grin. "Come on, let's get out of here before we have to start filling out paperwork." The two officers strolled back to their patrol car, laughing like they had just finished a harmless prank. But what they didn't realize was that their night of fun had just sealed their fate. In less than 12 hours, they would walk into their station expecting a normal shift, only to freeze in horror when they saw the same man they had humiliated standing at the front of the room, wearing the police chief's badge. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the small-town police department as officers arrived for what they assumed would be a routine shift. Jack Reynolds and Mike Sanders strolled in, laughing about the night before, still riding the high of their cruel joke. Mike stretched his arms, yawning. "Man, last night was priceless. Did you see his face? I bet he packed up and left town already." Jack smirked, adjusting his duty belt. "Yeah, serves him right. People need to learn their place around here." With that, they pushed open the doors to the station, stepping inside without a care in the world. The moment they walked into the briefing room, their laughter died instantly. Standing at the front of the room, wearing the police chief's badge, was the very man they had tied to a pole just hours ago. David Carter stood tall, his presence commanding, his gaze steady as he watched the officers file in. The rest of the department sat in stunned silence, waiting for introductions, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Jack's face drained of color, his body going rigid. Mike took an uneasy step back, as if hoping he had stepped into some kind of alternate reality. "No way. This can't be happening," he muttered under his breath. But it was happening. David let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment settle in. Then, with a measured voice, he spoke. "Good morning, officers. My name is Chief David Carter. As of today, I am in command of this department." A murmur rippled through the room, but David didn't acknowledge it. His focus remained locked on Jack and Mike, watching their discomfort grow with each passing second. He could see the panic in their eyes, the way their minds were scrambling for a way out, some excuse, some explanation for the unforgivable thing they had done. David clasped his hands behind his back, his voice calm, controlled. "Before we begin, I want to address something important. Last night, I had a first-hand experience with some, let's call it, unorthodox policing methods." His eyes flicked toward Jack and Mike, an experience that I'm sure at least 2 officers in this room would remember quite clearly. The room fell silent. Everyone's eyes darted toward Jack and Mike, whose faces had turned a sickly shade of pale. Beads of sweat formed on Jack's forehead as he swallowed hard. Mike let out a nervous chuckle, trying to regain some control. "Look, Chief, whatever happened, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. David raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No misunderstandings," he said coolly. "The facts are clear. Last night, 2 of my officers decided it would be amusing to restrain a citizen against a pole and laugh about it. They mocked him, degraded him, and treated him like an object of entertainment. That man, gentlemen, was me." Gasps filled the room. Officers exchanged looks of shock, while some visibly tensed, realizing that Jack and Mike had just humiliated their new chief of police. Jack, now visibly sweating, forced a stiff grin. "Chief Carter, we didn't know who you were. It was just a joke, you know? No harm meant—" David's expression remained unreadable. He slowly walked forward, closing the distance between himself and the 2 officers. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "If I weren't the chief, if I were just an ordinary black man passing through town, you would have left me tied up all night. You would have let me suffer for your own amusement." Jack and Mike stood frozen, unable to answer. David let the silence stretch again, his piercing stare making them squirm. "Gentlemen, what you did last night wasn't just a violation of protocol. It was a violation of everything this badge is supposed to represent. And let me be very clear. I will not tolerate this kind of behavior in my department." Jack stammered. "Chief, please, we—" David turned away from them, looking at the rest of the department. "I know that the culture here has been one of looking the other way. I know that officers like these two have operated unchecked for years. That ends today. From this moment forward, every officer in this department will be held accountable. If you abuse your power, if you mistreat civilians, if you tarnish this badge, you will answer for it." The room remained silent, officers sitting up straighter, some nodding in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably. David exhaled slowly before turning back to Jack and Mike. "Effective immediately. You are both suspended while an internal investigation is conducted. If found guilty, you will be stripped of your badges permanently. Consider yourselves lucky, because had I not been the chief, you wouldn't just be losing your jobs. You'd be facing criminal charges." Jack and Mike were speechless. Their world had just come crashing down in front of their colleagues, their so-called power vanishing in an instant. The same authority they had abused had now turned against them. David took a step back, his voice firm. "Hand over your badges and weapons, now." Jack hesitated for a brief moment before reluctantly unclipping his badge, placing it on the table. Mike did the same, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time, they weren't in control. David turned to Deputy Laura Matthews, who had been watching the entire exchange with a mix of satisfaction and relief. "Deputy Matthews, please escort these two officers out." Laura straightened her posture, nodding. "Yes, Chief?" She motioned for Jack and Mike to follow, and with hesitant, defeated steps they did. As the doors closed behind them, David turned back to the rest of the officers, his expression unreadable. "This is just the beginning. If you wear this badge, you will uphold its honor. If you can't, you don't belong here. I expect nothing less." The message was clear. The reign of unchecked corruption in this department was over. Jack and Mike had spent years believing they were untouchable. But today, they learned that justice had finally caught up with them. As the heavy doors of the police station swung shut behind Jack Reynolds and Mike Sanders, the reality of their downfall settled in. The air outside felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the very town they had once controlled had turned against them. Just last night, they had been on top of the world, laughing at their victim, treating him like nothing. Now they were disgraced, humiliated, stripped of everything they had built their identities on. They exchanged a glance, but neither spoke. What was there to say? They had been caught. Inside the station, David Carter remained at the front of the room, watching the remaining officers with a steady gaze. Some looked shaken, others relieved. He could tell that while some of them had played no part in Jack and Mike's abuse of power, they had witnessed it and done nothing to stop it. That silence made them complicit. It was a culture he was here to dismantle. David took a step forward, his presence commanding yet calm. "Now that we've handled unfinished business, let's talk about the future of this department." He let the words sink in before continuing. "I know some of you are wondering if this is just a show of power. It's not. This is a warning to all of you." His gaze swept across the room, making sure every single officer felt the weight of his words. What happened last night was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper issue that has plagued this town for far too long. And that stops today. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others sat straighter, almost relieved to hear someone finally addressing the corruption. David could tell who had been waiting for change and who had been benefiting from the old ways. He had seen it before in other departments, officers who abused their badges, who used their positions to instill fear instead of trust. But this time, they were dealing with a leader who wouldn't look the other way. He turned his attention to Deputy Laura Matthews, the only officer who had tried to intervene the night before. "Deputy Matthews," he said, his tone shifting slightly, "step forward." Laura hesitated for a second before standing tall and making her way to the front. She had spent years biting her tongue, watching as officers like Jack and Mike tarnished the department's name, but she had always known she couldn't fight them alone. David met her eyes and nodded. "I saw what you did last night. You spoke up when no one else did. That is the kind of leadership we need here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a new badge, one that held more weight than her previous one. "Effective immediately, I am promoting you to sergeant. You've earned it." A murmur ran through the room as officers exchanged glances. Laura's eyes widened as she took the badge, momentarily speechless. "Chief Carter, David held up a hand. "No need to thank me. Just do the job with integrity. This department needs people like you." She swallowed hard and nodded. "I won't let you down." David turned back to the room. "This is what accountability looks like. It's not about revenge. It's about making sure the right people wear this badge." He gestured toward the door where Jack and Mike had exited. "The days of unchecked power are over. If any of you believe you can continue that kind of behavior under my command, I suggest you resign now." A heavy silence followed. Some officers avoided eye contact, while others sat forward, their expressions serious. It was a moment of reckoning, a defining shift in the department's culture. David exhaled and softened his tone slightly. "Now, for those of you who believe in doing this job the right way, we move forward together. But make no mistake, I will be watching." For the first time in years, a real leader stood at the helm of the department, and every officer in that room knew, whether they liked it or not, that change had arrived. The weight of David Carter's words still hung in the air, thick with finality. The officers in the room sat motionless, processing everything that had just unfolded. Some looked relieved, others uneasy. But no one spoke against him. No one dared. Jack Reynolds and Mike Sanders were gone, stripped of their power, humiliated in front of the department they once controlled through fear. Deputy Laura Matthews now stood taller, holding her new badge as Sergeant Matthews, a title she had rightfully earned. And standing at the front of the room, radiating authority, was Chief Carter, a man who had arrived in this town as an unknown outsider, but now commanded absolute respect. David let his eyes sweep across the room before speaking again. "This isn't about what happened last night. It's about what's been happening for years. This department has had no accountability, no discipline, and no real leadership. That ends today." He could see the flickers of nervousness in some officers' faces, the ones who had turned a blind eye for too long, the ones who had let corruption seep into the foundation of the force. He leaned slightly forward. "I will be going through every single case file, every complaint, every misconduct report. If there are skeletons in your closets, now is the time to come clean. Because when I find them, and I will, there won't be any second chances." The tension in the room grew heavier. Officers exchanged cautious glances, but no one challenged him. David wasn't bluffing, and they knew it. He had built his reputation on reforming broken departments, on rooting out officers who wore the badge as a shield for their own corruption. This department would be no different. Sergeant Matthews cleared her throat, stepping forward. "Chief Carter, if I may?" David nodded, and she turned to address the room. "I know some of you have been frustrated, feeling like speaking up wouldn't change anything. But let me be clear. Things have changed. If you've been doing this job the right way, then you have nothing to worry about. But if you've been hiding behind your badge, abusing your power like Reynolds and Sanders, then you're next." A few officers sat taller, nodding slightly. Others kept their eyes fixed on the table, as if afraid to make any movement that might expose them. David let the silence stretch before finally stepping back. "If you're here to do your job with integrity, you have my full support. If not, then consider this your last warning." He turned to Matthews, handing her a stack of files. "I need a full report on the officers with the most civilian complaints by the end of the day." She nodded. "Already on it." With that, the meeting was over. Officers filed out, some still looking over their shoulders, but others walking with a newfound sense of purpose. The weight of corruption that had once suffocated the department was starting to lift. For the first time in years, there was hope. As the room emptied, David remained behind, staring at the department's emblem on the wall. He had fought this battle before, and he knew it wasn't over. Real change wouldn't happen overnight. There would be resistance, hidden enemies within the force who would try to fight back against his leadership. But that didn't matter. He had already won the first battle. Outside the station, Jack Reynolds and Mike Sanders sat in their truck, watching as officers walked in and out of the building that had once been their kingdom. Jack clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice filled with resentment. "That bastard ruined us." Mike exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "What the hell are we supposed to do now?" Jack's lips curled into a bitter smirk. "We wait." He cast one last glance at the station before starting the engine. For now, they were powerless. But they wouldn't stay that way forever. Back inside, David finally moved, heading toward his office. He wasn't here to play games. He was here to clean house. And if anyone thought they could stop him, they were in for a rude awakening. As David Carter sat in his office, he glanced at the files stacked neatly on his desk. Each one represented a case of unchecked misconduct, officers who had abused their positions for too long. He had come to this town expecting resistance, and he knew this was only the beginning. But that didn't matter. Change was already happening. Jack Reynolds and Mike Sanders had been removed, and the message was clear. Corruption would no longer be tolerated. Outside, the department was quieter than usual. Officers walked through the halls with a newfound awareness, knowing that every action, every decision, would now be held to a higher standard. Some welcomed the change, relieved that they could finally do their jobs the right way. Others remained wary, unsure if they could continue hiding their past actions. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Meanwhile, Jack and Mike sat in their truck, parked at the far end of town. The weight of their disgrace clung to them like a shadow. They had spent years believing they were untouchable, but in one night, their entire world had collapsed. Jack clenched his jaw, staring at the police station in the distance. "We'll see how long he lasts," he muttered. Mike said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. They weren't done yet, but neither was David Carter. Justice had arrived, and it wasn't leaving any time soon. What do you think? Did David handle the situation the right way? Let us know in the comments. If you love stories about justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. More eye-opening stories coming soon. Stay tuned.